On June 23, 2102, a curious doctor named Richard Gray descended into the bowels of Mariposa Military Base, seeking medical supplies, and emerged as something that would make humanity question the very nature of existence itself. What happened in those irradiated halls wasn't just a scientific accident, but the birth of a prophet whose vision of forced evolution would terrorize the wasteland for 60 years, and whose final words would haunt survivors long after his death. The transformation that began with a simple fall into a vat of experimental virus would create the most brilliant and terrifying mind the post-war world had ever known. Richard Gray, exiled murderer turned wasteland healer, would become the master, a grotesque fusion of flesh and machine, whose telepathic powers could bend super mutants to his will, and whose philosophical arguments for unity through mutation would challenge every assumption about human nature and survival. But this story begins not with the monster but with the man, not in the depths of scientific horror, but in the sterile safety of an underground vault, where a promising young citizen would commit an act so shocking that it would cast him into the wasteland to begin a journey that would reshape the very definition of what it means to be human. Richard Moreau was born into Vault 8, one of the most successful experiments in post-war survival, where advanced medical technology and strict social order had created what appeared to be humanity's best hope for rebuilding civilization. The vault that would later become Vault City represented everything the old world had dreamed of preserving through nuclear winter, with clean corridors, functioning technology, and citizens who had never known the harsh realities of radioactive survival. Yet beneath this veneer of success lay the same human nature that had destroyed the world above. Jealousy, ambition, and violence still found ways to express themselves even in the most controlled environments. The murder that would define Richard Moreau's fate remains shrouded in mystery, its circumstances lost to vault records that were either destroyed or classified beyond recovery. What we know is that on some forgotten day in 2092, the promising young citizen became a killer. The vault's justice system, designed for maintaining order in a closed society, offered no rehabilitation for such a fundamental breach of social contract. Exile was the only solution that could preserve the community's stability, while acknowledging that even in paradise, some sins could not be forgiven or contained. The vault door that had protected Moreau since birth became the gateway to his transformation from protected citizen to wasteland wanderer. The moment Richard Moreau stepped into the irradiated California wasteland, he ceased to exist. The man who emerged from that transition took the name Richard Gray, symbolically cutting all ties to his vault origins and the crime that had defined his previous existence. But the medical knowledge and intellectual curiosity that had shaped his vault education would prove invaluable in the harsh world that awaited him. The wasteland of 2092 bore little resemblance to the pre-war paradise that vault dwellers remembered through faded photographs and deteriorating holotapes. 15 years after the Great War, the landscape remained a testament to atomic devastation, where radiation storms could strip flesh from bone and mutated creatures prowled ruins that had once been thriving cities. For a vault dweller accustomed to filtered air and purified water, every breath and every sip represented a potential death sentence. Yet Gray possessed advantages that most surface dwellers lacked. His vault education had included advanced medical training and scientific knowledge that made him invaluable to survivor communities desperate for healing and understanding. While other exiles from the underground often perished within weeks of surface exposure, Gray's medical expertise became his currency for survival and his pathway to integration with wasteland society. The journey south from Vault 8 toward the major trading centers of post-war California would take months of careful navigation through territories controlled by raiders, mutated wildlife, and the lingering radiation zones that marked the sites of direct nuclear impact. Gray traveled with caravans when possible, offering medical services in exchange for protection and supplies, gradually adapting to the rhythms of wasteland life, while maintaining the intellectual curiosity that would ultimately prove both his greatest strength and his fatal weakness. The hub, when Gray finally reached it, represented everything that post-war civilization aspired to become, built around the ruins of what had once been Los Angeles. The settlement had grown into the wasteland's premier trading center, where merchants from across California gathered to exchange goods, information, and the hope that humanity might someday rebuild what the bombs had destroyed. For an exiled vault dweller with medical skills and scientific knowledge, The hub offered opportunities that no other wasteland community could match. But there was something else growing in Richard Gray's mind during those long months of travel and adaptation. Something that Vault life had perhaps always contained, but wasteland exposure had awakened and amplified. The radiation that every surface dweller absorbed as a simple fact of existence was changing him in ways that went beyond the obvious physical adaptations. His thinking was becoming more complex, more interconnected, more capable of perceiving patterns and possibilities that normal human consciousness couldn't grasp. The medical practice that Gray would establish in the hub wasn't just a means of survival, but a laboratory for studying the ongoing evolution of post-war humanity. Every patient who sought his help represented a data point in understanding how radiation, mutation, and environmental pressure were reshaping human biology and psychology. Gray began to see not just individual suffering, but species-wide adaptation, not just personal healing, but evolutionary potential. Yet even as his reputation grew and his understanding deepened, Gray remained haunted by the fundamental question that had driven him from Vault safety into wasteland uncertainty. What was the true purpose of human survival in a world that seemed designed to eliminate the species entirely? The answer to that question lay waiting in a military installation that had been abandoned since the war, where experimental viruses and automated systems continued their work in silence, preparing for the moment when the right mind would arrive to unlock their terrible potential. The friendship that would ultimately lead Richard Gray to his transformation began with a chance encounter in a hub tavern, where a radiation-scarred trader named Harold was telling stories about pre-war installations and the treasures they might contain for explorers brave enough to face their dangers. The world that Richard Moreau inhabited during his first 26 years of existence was a masterpiece of social engineering, where every aspect of daily life had been designed to preserve the best elements of pre-war American civilization, while eliminating the chaos and conflict that had led to global nuclear annihilation. Vault 8 represented Vault-Tec Corporation's vision of humanity's future, a self-contained society where advanced technology and strict social order would create the foundation for rebuilding the world when surface conditions became habitable again. The Vault's medical bay, where young Moreau received his education and training, contained equipment that surpassed anything available in the old world. Automated surgical systems could perform operations with precision that human hands could never achieve, while diagnostic computers could analyze biological samples and predict health outcomes with supernatural accuracy. The medical knowledge preserved in Vault 8's databases included not just conventional treatments but experimental research into genetic therapy, radiation exposure, and biological adaptation that had been developing when the bombs fell. Moreau's exceptional aptitude for medical science had marked him from childhood as one of the Vault's most promising citizens. His understanding of human biology exceeded that of many of his instructors, while his ability to synthesize complex information and identify patterns in seemingly unrelated data suggested intellectual capabilities that might someday contribute to humanity's post-war recovery. The Vault's leadership had designated him for advanced education and eventual inclusion in the decision-making processes that would guide the community's eventual transition to surface existence. But Vault 8's social perfection contained the same fundamental flaws that had characterized every human society throughout history. The controlled environment that eliminated external threats and resource competition couldn't eliminate the basic drives and conflicts that arose from human nature itself. Jealousy, ambition, sexual rivalry, and ideological disagreement still found expression within the Vault's sterile corridors, creating tensions that the community's rigid structure struggled to contain. The murder that destroyed Richard Moreau's future occurred during what Vault records describe only as a personal dispute between citizens, with details classified or redacted beyond any possibility of reconstruction. What survived the bureaucratic sanitization was evidence of premeditation, violence, and a complete breakdown of the social conditioning that was supposed to prevent such incidents from occurring within the Vault's controlled population. The victim's identity remains unknown, lost to records that were either destroyed deliberately or damaged beyond recovery. When Vault 8 eventually opened and became the surface city of Vault City, the motivation for the crime disappeared along with most other details, leaving only the stark fact that one of the Vault's most promising citizens had committed the ultimate violation of community trust and social order. The trial that followed represented Vault 8's justice system at its most formal and impersonal. The evidence was overwhelming, the crime was undeniable, and the community's survival depended on maintaining social stability through swift and decisive action. The Vault's leadership faced a choice between execution, which would eliminate a valuable citizen but preserve social order, and exile, which would remove the threat while preserving the possibility that Moreau's medical knowledge might someday benefit surface communities. The decision to exile rather than execute reflected Vault 8's fundamental optimism about human nature and redemption. The Vault's founding principles included the belief that even the most serious crimes might be corrected through separation from the social pressures that had contributed to their occurrence. Exile would give Moreau an opportunity to prove whether his value as a healer could outweigh his failure as a citizen. The preparation for exile involved more than simply opening the vault door and pushing the criminal into the wasteland. Moreau was provided with basic survival equipment, medical supplies, and documentation that would identify him to surface communities as a trained physician rather than simply another dangerous exile. The Vault's leadership understood that his survival would depend on his ability to contribute to wasteland society rather than prey upon it. The name change from Richard Moreau to Richard Gray occurred at the moment of exile, as the vault door sealed behind him for what everyone assumed would be the final time. The transformation wasn't just practical but psychological, representing a complete break from his vault identity and the crime that had defined his relationship with the only community he had ever known. Richard Moreau died in the vault's airlock, and Richard Gray was born in the radioactive wasteland. The first months of surface existence tested every aspect of Gray's vault education and personal resilience. The radiation levels that surface dwellers considered normal would have killed most vault citizens within days, while the contaminated food and water that comprised the wasteland diet contained toxins and pathogens that vault medical training had never encountered. Gray's survival depended on his ability to adapt his knowledge to conditions that no pre-war textbook had anticipated. The mutations that began appearing in Gray's physiology during these early months weren't immediately obvious or debilitating, but they represented the beginning of changes that would eventually transform him beyond recognition. Increased radiation tolerance allowed him to travel through areas that would kill normal humans, while enhanced cellular regeneration accelerated healing from injuries and illnesses that would permanently disable others. These adaptations weren't random but represented directed responses to environmental pressures that suggested some underlying biological program was guiding his development. The medical practice that Gray established during his journey toward the hub began as simple survival necessity, but evolved into systematic research into post-war human adaptation. Every patient he treated provided data about how radiation exposure was affecting human biology, while every successful treatment added to his understanding of how medical knowledge could be modified to address conditions that had never existed before the war. The trading caravans that carried Gray toward the hub also exposed him to the full spectrum of post-war humanity, from relatively normal survivors who had adapted to wasteland conditions to severely mutated beings whose humanity was barely recognizable. The ghoul traders whose skin had been transformed by radiation, but whose minds remained intact, fascinated Gray with their evidence that human consciousness could survive even extreme biological transformation. The philosophical questions that began forming in Gray's mind during these months of travel would eventually evolve into the unity ideology that would terrorize the wasteland. If human biology could be modified by environmental pressure to enhance survival capabilities, why should such modifications be left to chance and natural selection? If consciousness could survive radical physical transformation, what possibilities might exist for deliberately guiding human evolution toward optimal survival configurations? The hub, when Gray finally reached it in late 2092, represented the pinnacle of post-war civilization and the testing ground where his theories about human enhancement would begin their evolution toward monstrous reality. The settlement's diverse population included examples of every type of post-war adaptation, from vault dwellers like himself, to tribal survivors, to heavily mutated beings who had found ways to thrive in the harshest environments. The medical clinic that Gray established in the hub quickly became essential to the community's survival and prosperity. His vault-trained expertise, combined with his growing understanding of radiation medicine, made him invaluable to traders and travelers who needed treatment for conditions that would kill them anywhere else. But the real laboratory was in Gray's mind. where every patient contributed to his developing understanding of human potential and evolutionary possibility. The friendship with Harold, that would ultimately lead to Gray's transformation, began with medical consultation about Harold's own radiation exposure and mutation. Harold's good-natured acceptance of his physical changes and his stories about pre-war installations that might contain advanced medical technology captured Gray's imagination and redirected his research toward the abandoned facilities that dotted the wasteland like monuments to scientific hubris. The conversations between Gray and Harold during the years leading up to their fateful expedition revealed the intellectual partnership that would make their journey possible and the philosophical differences that would determine their different responses to what they discovered. Harold approached pre-war technology with practical curiosity and healthy skepticism, while Gray saw it as the key to unlocking humanity's evolutionary potential and transcending the limitations that had led to global destruction. The decision to organize an expedition to Mariposa Military Base represented the culmination of Gray's decade-long evolution from exiled murderer to wasteland philosopher. The facility's reputation as a center for biological weapons research made it irresistible to someone whose medical practice had become a laboratory for studying human enhancement. What Gray expected to find there was advanced research that might accelerate his understanding of human potential. What he actually found would transform him into something that transcended every assumption about the boundaries between human and inhuman consciousness. The hub in 2092 pulsed with the desperate energy of survivors who had transformed catastrophe into opportunity, building the wasteland's most successful trading empire from the radioactive bones of what had once been Los Angeles. The settlement sprawled across multiple districts connected by carefully maintained roads and protected by walls that incorporated salvaged materials from a dozen ruined cities. For Richard Gray, stepping into this bustling marketplace after months of wasteland travel felt like discovering civilization's heartbeat still pumping beneath the surface of atomic devastation. The medical district where Gray established his practice occupied converted buildings that had once housed pre-war businesses, their facades modified with scavenged medical equipment and hand-painted signs advertising everything from radiation treatment to surgical procedures. The competition among healers was fierce, with established doctors viewing newcomers with suspicion and territorial hostility. Yet Gray's vault-trained expertise quickly distinguished him from practitioners whose knowledge came primarily from trial-and-error experimentation on desperate patients. The first patient who walked through Gray's makeshift clinic door carried the unmistakable signs of advanced radiation poisoning, with skin lesions that indicated cellular breakdown and organ failure that conventional wasteland medicine could only delay rather than cure. The treatment protocols that Gray administered drew upon medical knowledge that had been advancing right up until the moment the bombs fell, incorporating techniques for cellular regeneration and toxin neutralization that most surface doctors had never encountered. The successful treatment created ripples throughout the hub's medical community and established Gray's reputation as something approaching a miracle worker. Patients began traveling from distant settlements seeking treatment for conditions that other doctors had declared hopeless, while local physicians grudgingly acknowledged that the newcomer possessed knowledge that could benefit everyone if he could be convinced to share it rather than hoard it for competitive advantage. But Gray's true innovation wasn't in his treatment methods, but in his systematic approach to documenting and analyzing the long-term effects of radiation exposure on human physiology. Each patient represented a data point in understanding how atomic contamination was reshaping human biology, while successful treatments provided insights into the body's adaptive capabilities and evolutionary potential. The medical records that Gray maintained during his hub years would have astounded pre-war researchers with their documentation of genetic changes occurring in real time. The philosophical discussions that began emerging in Gray's conversations with patients and colleagues revealed the intellectual framework that would eventually evolve into the unity ideology. If radiation exposure was causing beneficial adaptations alongside harmful mutations, why should such changes be left to random environmental pressure rather than guided by scientific understanding? If human consciousness could survive significant biological modification, what possibilities existed for deliberately enhancing human capabilities beyond natural limitations? The ghoul population that frequented the hub provided Gray with his most fascinating subjects for studying the relationship between physical transformation and mental preservation. These heavily irradiated beings had undergone cellular changes that should have been fatal, yet many retained intelligence and personality characteristics that seemed enhanced rather than diminished by their mutations. The ghouls' extended lifespans and resistance to further radiation damage suggested that extreme biological modification might actually represent evolutionary advancement rather than degradation. Harold's arrival at Gray's clinic in 2095 marked the beginning of the partnership that would ultimately lead to both men's transformation, though neither suspected the cosmic significance of their meeting. Harold's radiation-induced mutations were progressing slowly but steadily, causing skin changes and cellular modifications that fascinated Gray with their precision and apparent purposefulness. The treatment sessions became extended philosophical discussions about the nature of mutation, evolution, and human potential. Harold's stories about abandoned military installations and corporate research facilities captured Gray's imagination with their implications for advancing his understanding of human enhancement. The pre-war world had been conducting biological research that made current wasteland medicine seem primitive by comparison, with genetic engineering capabilities and viral modification techniques that could theoretically guide human evolution in any desired direction. If such knowledge could be recovered and applied to post-war conditions, the possibilities for species improvement were limitless. The trading expeditions that Harold organized provided Gray with opportunities to study human adaptation across different environmental conditions, while gathering information about pre-war installations that might contain advanced research materials. Each journey revealed new examples of successful mutation and adaptation, from tribal communities that had developed enhanced radiation resistance to isolated settlements where genetic changes had created entirely new human subspecies. The medical supplies that Gray acquired during these expeditions included pre-war pharmaceuticals and diagnostic equipment that remained functional despite decades of storage in irradiated conditions. The advanced chemistry and biological analysis capabilities represented in these materials suggested research programs that had been developing enhancement techniques far beyond anything attempted in peacetime scientific research. The military applications were obvious, but Gray began envisioning civilian users that could transform human survival capabilities. The patient population that Gray treated during his hub years included examples of nearly every type of post-war human adaptation, from subtle genetic modifications that enhanced immune system function to dramatic physical changes that completely altered sensory capabilities and environmental tolerance. The successful treatments demonstrated that biological modification could be controlled and directed, rather than simply endured as an inevitable consequence of environmental exposure. The research notes that Gray compiled during this period revealed systematic thinking about human enhancement that went far beyond conventional medical practice. His observations about cellular regeneration, genetic adaptation, and consciousness preservation suggested theoretical frameworks for deliberately guiding human evolution toward optimal survival configurations. The scientific methodology was impeccable, but the implications were revolutionary in ways that Gray himself didn't yet fully understand. The friendship between Gray and Harold deepened through shared expeditions and collaborative research into pre-war technology and biological adaptation. Harold's practical experience with wasteland survival complemented Gray's theoretical knowledge, while Harold's good-natured acceptance of his own mutations provided a psychological model for embracing rather than fearing biological change. Their partnership represented the perfect combination of scientific expertise and practical application. The planning for the Mariposa expedition began in earnest during 2101, as Gray's research reached theoretical limits that could only be transcended through access to pre-war biological research and experimental materials. The military installation's reputation as a center for genetic warfare development made it irresistible to someone whose medical practice had evolved into systematic study of human enhancement possibilities. The facility promised to contain research data and experimental materials that could revolutionize understanding of biological modification. The expedition preparations revealed the extent to which Gray's thinking had evolved beyond conventional medical practice towards something approaching scientific obsession. The equipment list included not just medical supplies and diagnostic tools, but biological sampling materials and laboratory apparatus that suggested intentions far beyond simple exploration and resource gathering. Gray was preparing to conduct research that would push the boundaries of ethical medical practice and venture into territories that peacetime science had never explored. The team that assembled for the Mariposa expedition included Harold as co-leader, several hub traders seeking valuable salvage, and guards hired for protection against the mutated creatures and automated defenses that were rumored to protect the installation. None of them fully understood Gray's scientific objectives, but his reputation as a healer and his promise to share any medical discoveries ensured their cooperation and support. The final conversations between Gray and Harold, before departing for Mariposa, revealed the philosophical differences that would ultimately determine their different responses to what they discovered. Harold approached the expedition with practical curiosity and healthy skepticism about the value and safety of pre-war military research. Gray saw it as an opportunity to unlock the secrets of directed human evolution and transcend the limitations that had led to global nuclear destruction. The departure from the hub on June 20th, 2102 marked the end of Richard Gray's career as a wasteland healer and the beginning of his journey toward transformation into something that would challenge every assumption about the boundaries between human and inhuman consciousness. The man who left the hub that morning was already evolving beyond conventional human limitations, but the changes that awaited him at Mariposa would remake him into something that transcended every previous understanding of consciousness, evolution, and the potential for beings that had once been human to become something entirely new. The journey from the hub to Mariposa Military Base stretched across 150 miles of terrain that seemed designed by atomic fire to test every survival skill that wasteland existence could teach. The expedition's route wound through radiation zones, where invisible death hung in the air like morning mist, past settlements that had been abandoned when their water sources turned poisonous, and into territories where mutated predators had evolved hunting strategies that could outmatch human intelligence and weaponry combined. Richard Gray approached the expedition with scientific methodology that Harold found both admirable and slightly unnerving. Every mile of travel became an opportunity for data collection about radiation exposure, environmental adaptation, and the biological modifications that different regions had imposed upon their inhabitants. Gray's notebooks filled with observations about plant mutations, animal behavior, and the subtle physiological changes that team members experienced as they moved through areas where atomic contamination had reached levels that should have been immediately fatal. The expedition team had expanded during the journey to include traders and scavengers who hoped to profit from whatever pre-war technology remained functional at the military installation. The group dynamics revealed interesting patterns of leadership and cooperation under stress conditions that Gray documented with the same methodical attention he had once applied to patient treatment. Harold's natural charisma made him the expedition's practical leader, while Gray's intellectual authority established him as the mission's scientific director. The first signs of Mariposa's continuing activity appeared 2 days before the expedition reached the installation itself. Automated patrol units had been detected moving through the surrounding area, their behavior patterns suggesting that the base's security systems remained functional despite decades of abandonment. The implications excited Gray with possibilities for accessing intact research facilities and operational equipment that could revolutionize understanding of pre-war biological research programs. The military installation that emerged from the wasteland haze exceeded every expectation that Gray had developed during months of planning and preparation. Mariposa Military Base sprawled across several square miles of carefully engineered terrain, with surface structures that had weathered atomic bombardment and decades of environmental exposure, while maintaining structural integrity that suggested construction techniques far beyond civilian engineering capabilities. The facility represented the pinnacle of pre-war military architecture and defensive planning. The perimeter defenses that protected Mariposa included automated weapons systems, electronic detection networks, and biological countermeasures that were still operational after 25 years of environmental exposure and mechanical wear. The expedition's approach required careful reconnaissance and technical expertise that tested every member's specialized knowledge and survival skills. Gray found himself fascinated by defensive systems that incorporated biological recognition technology and response protocols that seemed designed to distinguish between human and non-human intruders. The surface installations provided tantalizing glimpses of the research programs that had been conducted at Mariposa before the Great War. Equipment housing suggested laboratories dedicated to biological modification, while communication arrays indicated coordination with other military research facilities across the continent. The The scale and sophistication of the visible infrastructure suggested underground facilities that would contain research materials and experimental apparatus beyond anything Gray had previously encountered. Harold's expertise in electronic systems and mechanical engineering proved essential for bypassing security measures and accessing the installation's interior spaces. The cooperation between Harold's practical skills and Gray's theoretical knowledge created synergies that enabled the expedition to penetrate defenses that would have stopped less prepared exploration teams. Their partnership represented the perfect combination of technical competence and scientific curiosity necessary for understanding pre-war military research. The descent into Mariposa's underground levels revealed the true scope of the biological research programs that had been conducted at the facility. Laboratory after laboratory contained equipment for genetic analysis, viral modification, and biological enhancement that exceeded anything available in pre-war civilian research institutions. The implications for Gray's own research into human enhancement were staggering, suggesting possibilities for controlled evolution that went far beyond anything he had previously imagined. The research documentation that survived in Mariposa's computer systems provided Gray with access to theoretical frameworks and experimental results that revolutionized his understanding of biological modification possibilities. The forced evolutionary virus represented the culmination of decades of military research into human enhancement, with capabilities for genetic modification that could theoretically reshape human biology according to any desired specifications. The potential applications were limitless, suggesting possibilities for species improvement that could eliminate every limitation that had contributed to pre-war civilization's destruction. The expedition members who accompanied Gray into Mariposa's depths began experiencing physiological changes that suggested exposure to biological agents and environmental factors that were affecting their cellular structure and genetic expression. The modifications weren't immediately harmful, but they represented the beginning of adaptive changes that would become more pronounced with continued exposure to the facility's experimental materials and atmospheric contamination. The FEV research chambers contained active viral cultures and automated systems that had continued operating despite decades of abandonment and minimal maintenance. The biological materials remained viable and potent, suggesting storage and preservation techniques that exceeded anything available in civilian medical facilities. Gray found himself confronted with research materials that could advance his understanding of human enhancement by decades or centuries if he could access and analyze them properly. The experimental documentation revealed that Mariposa's researchers had been developing enhancement techniques that went far beyond simple biological modification to encompass directed evolution and consciousness expansion. The theoretical frameworks suggested possibilities for creating enhanced human beings with capabilities that transcended every previous understanding of species potential. The military applications were obvious, but Gray began envisioning civilian uses that could transform human survival and adaptation capabilities. The team members who had followed Gray deeper into the facility began showing signs of stress and psychological pressure as the implications of their discoveries became apparent. The research materials and experimental apparatus represented power to reshape human nature itself, but the responsibility for making decisions about such capabilities exceeded anything that wasteland survivors were prepared to handle. The expedition was confronting questions about human evolution and enhancement that challenged every assumption about natural development and species improvement. Harold's growing unease about the expedition's direction reflected practical concerns about safety and the wisdom of interfering with pre-war military research that had been abandoned for good reasons. The biological agents and experimental materials posed obvious dangers, while the psychological pressure of making decisions about human enhancement capabilities created stress that was affecting team cohesion and decision-making processes. Harold began advocating for limited sampling and careful withdrawal, rather than extensive investigation. Gray's fascination with the research materials and experimental possibilities overwhelmed his caution and practical judgment. The theoretical frameworks and biological agents represented opportunities for advancing human evolution that might never be available again if the expedition retreated without fully exploring Mariposa's capabilities. The scientific potential justified risks that more prudent researchers would have avoided, but Gray's intellectual curiosity had evolved beyond normal scientific ethics and safety considerations. The fatal decision to investigate the main FEV research chamber occurred on June 23, 2102, When Gray's scientific enthusiasm finally overcame Harold's practical objections and the expedition's collective caution, the chamber contained active viral cultures and automated systems that represented the pinnacle of pre-war biological research, with capabilities for human enhancement that exceeded everything Gray had previously discovered or imagined. The opportunity to access such materials seemed worth any conceivable risk. The automated defense systems that protected the FEV chamber had been designed to prevent unauthorized access while preserving research materials and experimental apparatus for future utilization. The security protocols included biological recognition technology and response systems that could distinguish between authorized personnel and potential intruders. Gray's medical knowledge and Harold's technical expertise enabled them to bypass initial defenses, but deeper systems required direct interaction with equipment that had been modified by decades of viral exposure and environmental contamination. The robot arm that struck Gray during his investigation of the FEV research apparatus wasn't malfunctioning but responding to programmed protocols designed to protect experimental materials from contamination or unauthorized access. The impact knocked Gray unconscious and caused him to fall into the viral culture vat that contained active FEV in concentrations that would prove immediately transformative rather than gradually adaptive. The accident represented the convergence of scientific curiosity, technical failure, and cosmic irony that would reshape the wasteland's future. Harold's desperate attempts to rescue Gray from the FEV vat were hampered by automated systems that prevented unauthorized access to experimental materials, and the immediate effects of viral exposure that made physical contact extremely dangerous. The rescue efforts had to be abandoned when Gray's unconscious form became submerged in viral culture that began causing visible biological changes within minutes of exposure. Harold faced the terrible choice between attempting a rescue that would likely kill them both and retreating to save the surviving expedition members. The retreat from Mariposa represented Harold's most difficult decision, and the beginning of guilt that would haunt him for the rest of his extended lifespan. Leaving Gray behind violated every principle of friendship and loyalty, but the alternative would have resulted in additional deaths without improving Gray's survival chances. The expedition's withdrawal marked the end of Richard Gray's existence as a recognizable human being, and the beginning of his transformation into something that would challenge every assumption about consciousness, evolution, and the potential for beings that had once been human. The return to consciousness came not as awakening, but as rebirth, with Richard Gray's mind emerging from viral-induced coma to discover that the fundamental nature of existence itself had been rewritten during his submersion in the forced evolutionary virus. The liquid that filled his lungs should have drowned him, but his respiratory system had already begun adapting to extract oxygen directly from the chemical solution. The pain that racked his body wasn't injury but reconstruction, as every cell underwent genetic modification that transformed biological limitations into evolutionary opportunities. The initial moments of awareness brought terror that transcended every previous human experience of fear and helplessness. Gray's medical knowledge allowed him to understand the cellular breakdown occurring throughout his body, while his enhanced consciousness perceived the reconstruction process with clinical clarity that made the horror more intense rather than more bearable. Flesh was melting and reforming according to genetic instructions that exceeded anything in terrestrial biology, while bone structure dissolved and regenerated in configurations that would have been impossible for baseline human physiology. The FEV concentration that surrounded Gray represented the distilled essence of decades of military research into human enhancement, with viral modifications that had been designed to accelerate evolution beyond anything that natural selection could achieve across millennia of environmental pressure. The solution contained genetic templates for enhanced strength, extended lifespan, improved intelligence, and biological adaptations that would enable survival in environments that would kill unmodified humans within minutes of exposure. The transformation process that began with cellular breakdown soon revealed its reconstructive purpose as Gray's body mass began expanding through absorption of organic material from the viral solution and integration of technological components from the laboratory environment. The growth wasn't random but followed patterns that suggested conscious design and deliberate optimization for enhanced capabilities that exceeded baseline human potential in every measurable dimension. The emergence of additional faces and limbs throughout Gray's expanding flesh mass represented the virus's solution to consciousness preservation during radical biological modification. Rather than replacing human neural architecture with alien alternatives, Phoebe had chosen to multiply and distribute cognitive functions across multiple brain structures that maintained individual personality, while enabling collective processing capabilities that transcended normal human thought patterns. The pain that accompanied each phase of transformation served educational purposes by forcing Gray's enhanced consciousness to understand and integrate the changes occurring throughout his expanding biological system. Every modification required conscious acceptance and psychological adaptation, while the enhanced intelligence that accompanied physical reconstruction enabled him to comprehend transformation processes that would have driven normal human minds to complete breakdown and insanity. The mechanical integration that began during the third month of transformation represented FEV's most sophisticated enhancement, as viral modifications enabled Gray's nervous system to interface directly with computer hardware and electronic systems throughout the laboratory complex. The technological fusion wasn't parasitic but symbiotic, with biological and electronic components forming hybrid systems that exceeded the capabilities of either technology independently. The access to Mariposa's computer networks that accompanied Gray's technological integration provided him with complete documentation of the FEV research program and theoretical frameworks for understanding the transformation process that was reshaping his consciousness and physical form. The research databases contained decades of experimental results and theoretical projections that enabled Gray to comprehend his mutation as the successful culmination of military enhancement research rather than accidental exposure to dangerous biological agents. The intelligence enhancement that accompanied physical transformation exceeded simple increases in processing speed or memory capacity to encompass qualitative changes in consciousness that enabled perception of patterns and relationships that remained invisible to baseline human awareness. Gray's enhanced mind could perceive biological systems, social dynamics, and environmental factors as interconnected networks whose interactions followed predictable principles that could be understood and manipulated through scientific methodology. The telepathic capabilities that emerged during the 6th month of transformation represented the virus's solution to communication and coordination challenges that would accompany the creation of enhanced human populations. The psychic connection wasn't magical but biological, with specialized neural structures that could transmit and receive electromagnetic signals, encoded with complex information patterns that exceeded anything possible through conventional communication technologies. The philosophical questions that occupied Gray's enhanced consciousness during the transformation period focused on the implications of his mutation for human survival and evolutionary development. If Eve could create beings with capabilities that exceeded baseline human potential in every measurable dimension, why should such enhancement be limited to accidental exposure rather than systematic application to entire populations? The virus had demonstrated that human limitations were choices rather than biological necessities. The isolation that accompanied Gray's transformation provided opportunities for extensive self-examination and theoretical development that would have been impossible under normal social conditions. The months of solitude enabled him to integrate his enhanced capabilities while developing philosophical frameworks for understanding his role as the first example of deliberately enhanced human consciousness. The loneliness was profound, but it served essential purposes for psychological adaptation and intellectual development. The first successful experiments with biological modification of captured animals demonstrated that Gray's transformation wasn't unique, but represented reproducible enhancement techniques that could be applied to any biological system with appropriate modifications and preparation. The ability to guide viral modification according to desired outcomes suggested possibilities for species improvement that exceeded anything attempted in pre-war research programs. The development of unity ideology began during Gray's first year of transformation, as he contemplated the implications of his enhanced capabilities for human survival and species development. If individual enhancement could produce such dramatic improvements in intelligence, strength, and environmental adaptation, systematic enhancement of entire populations could eliminate every limitation that had contributed to pre-war civilization's destruction through nuclear warfare and environmental collapse. The creation of his first super-mutant subjects represented the practical application of theoretical frameworks that Gray had developed during months of isolation and self-examination. the successful transformation of captured humans into enhanced beings with capabilities that exceeded baseline human potential in every measurable dimension demonstrated that individual enhancement could be scaled to population levels through careful application of modified viral agents. The psychological integration that occurred during Gray's second year of transformation involved accepting his evolution beyond human limitations, while maintaining essential elements of his original personality and moral framework. The enhanced consciousness that emerged from viral modification retained Richard Gray's intellectual curiosity and desire to heal suffering, but applied these drives to species-level challenges that required solutions beyond anything that conventional medicine could provide. The realization that human survival in post-war conditions required enhancement rather than simple adaptation marked the completion of Gray's psychological transformation from individual healer to species-level visionary. The wasteland environment would continue imposing evolutionary pressures that exceeded baseline human adaptive capabilities, making enhancement a necessity rather than an option for long-term species survival and prosperity. The theological implications of Gray's transformation extended beyond questions of personal identity to encompass fundamental issues about consciousness, evolution, and the potential for beings that had once been human to transcend every previous limitation of biological existence. The enhanced consciousness that emerged from viral modification represented a new form of intelligence that combined human intuition with capabilities that exceeded anything in terrestrial evolution. The loneliness that accompanied Gray's enhanced existence created psychological pressures that could only be resolved through the creation of additional enhanced beings capable of meaningful communication and social interaction. The desire for companionship wasn't selfish but practical, as the implementation of species-wide enhancement would require cooperation between multiple enhanced consciousnesses working toward common evolutionary objectives. The decision to begin systematic creation of enhanced human populations marked the end of Gray's personal transformation and the beginning of his mission to guide human evolution toward survival capabilities that could ensure species continuity despite environmental challenges that exceeded anything in Earth's biological history. The Master had been born from Richard Gray's flesh, but the unity that would emerge from his enhanced consciousness represented hope for humanity's transformation into something capable of transcending every limitation that had previously defined the species' potential for survival and development. The winter of 2102 brought Richard Gray's first successful creation of what he would eventually term super mutants, though the early experiments bore little resemblance to the organized army that would later terrorize the California wasteland. The subjects were desperate wanderers who had sought shelter in the Mariposa facility's outer chambers, drawn by rumors of medical supplies and protection from the harsh environmental conditions that made winter survival nearly impossible for unprepared travelers. Gray's approach to human enhancement during this period reflected the methodical medical training that had defined his pre-transformation career, combined with enhanced intellectual capabilities that enabled him to perceive biological systems and genetic interactions with unprecedented clarity. Each potential subject underwent extensive evaluation to determine their suitability for FEV modification, with Gray developing criteria that balanced genetic potential with psychological stability and adaptive capacity. The first successful transformation occurred in December of 2102, when a radiation-scarred trader named Marcus volunteered for what Gray described as advanced medical treatment that could eliminate the progressive cellular damage that threatened to kill him within months. The enhancement process that followed represented Gray's first practical application of the theoretical frameworks he had developed during his own transformation period. Marcus emerged from the viral modification process as something that exceeded every expectation Gray had developed about VV's enhancement potential. The physical improvements were immediately obvious, with increased height, muscle mass, and bone density that made the enhanced being capable of surviving environmental conditions and physical trauma that would kill baseline humans. But the intellectual enhancement proved even more remarkable, with Marcus demonstrating problem-solving abilities and pattern recognition that exceeded his pre-modification capabilities by orders of magnitude. The telepathic connection that formed between Gray and Marcus during the enhancement process represented the first practical demonstration of the psychic network that would eventually enable Unity's collective consciousness and coordinated operations. The mental link wasn't invasive but cooperative, with both enhanced beings maintaining individual personalities while sharing access to knowledge, experiences, and analytical capabilities that exceeded what either could achieve independently. The success of Marcus's transformation provided Gray with empirical evidence that his theories about guided human evolution were practical rather than merely speculative. The enhancement process could be refined and replicated, creating populations of enhanced beings whose capabilities would enable survival and prosperity under environmental conditions that remained lethal for unmodified humans. The implications for species-wide survival were revolutionary. The psychological adaptation that accompanied Marcus's physical transformation revealed the importance of mental preparation and voluntary participation in the enhancement process. Unlike the forced conversions that would characterize later Unity operations, the early transformations were collaborative endeavors that preserved individual identity while expanding consciousness and capabilities. The willing subjects developed stronger telepathic connections and more stable personalities than those who would later be enhanced against their will. The practical applications of enhanced capabilities became apparent during the harsh winter months that followed Marcus's transformation. The supermutant could venture into radiation zones and environmental conditions that would kill unmodified humans, gathering supplies and resources that enabled the small community to survive conditions that had previously been unsurvivable. The enhanced being's extended lifespan and improved healing abilities made him capable of taking risks that baseline humans couldn't consider. The recruitment of additional subjects during 2103 reflected Gray's growing understanding of the social and psychological factors that influenced enhancement success rates. Volunteers who approached the transformation with intellectual curiosity and acceptance of biological change adapted more successfully than those who were motivated primarily by desperation or fear. The enhancement process required psychological preparation that enabled subjects to maintain mental stability during the radical biological modifications. The development of specialized enhancement techniques for different types of subjects represented Gray's systematic approach to optimizing the transformation process for maximum benefit and minimum psychological trauma. Warriors received modifications that emphasized physical capabilities and combat effectiveness, while intellectuals underwent enhancements that prioritized cognitive expansion and analytical abilities. The customized approach produced superior results compared to standardized enhancement protocols. The establishment of basic manufacturing capabilities within the Mariposa facility enabled Gray's growing community to produce equipment and supplies that were optimized for enhanced physiology and capabilities. Standard wasteland gear proved inadequate for beings whose strength and size exceeded baseline human parameters, while enhanced sensory capabilities required specialized instruments and communication equipment that could accommodate telepathic as well as conventional information exchange. The territorial expansion that began during 2104 represented the first systematic attempt to establish secure zones where enhanced beings could operate without interference from baseline human populations, who might react with fear or hostility to their appearance and capabilities. The protected areas provided opportunities for enhanced communities to develop their own social structures and cultural practices without external pressure to conform to unmodified human expectations. The philosophical discussions that occupied much of Gray's attention during this period focused on the ethical implications of human enhancement and the responsibilities that enhanced beings owed to unmodified populations. The development of Unity ideology represented Gray's attempt to create moral frameworks that would justify systematic enhancement while preserving essential elements of human dignity and individual choice. The first encounters with human settlements during territorial expansion revealed the complex social dynamics that would characterize relationships between enhanced and unmodified populations throughout the Unity period. Fear and hostility were common responses to supermutant appearance, but some communities demonstrated curiosity and willingness to cooperate with beings whose capabilities could provide security and resources that baseline humans couldn't achieve independently. The resource acquisition operations that supported Gray's expanding community required careful balance between meeting enhanced population needs and avoiding conflicts with human settlements that depended on the same materials and supplies. The supermutants' enhanced capabilities made them formidable competitors for scarce resources. But Gray understood that systematic exploitation of human communities would generate organized resistance that could threaten his long-term objectives. The communication networks that Gray established between Mariposa and outlying facilities represented the first practical application of the telepathic capabilities that would eventually enable Unity's collective consciousness and coordinated operations. The psychic connections could transmit complex information across distances that exceeded radio range while maintaining security that conventional communication technologies couldn't provide. The training programs that Gray developed for newly enhanced subjects focused on psychological adaptation and social integration rather than simply physical conditioning and combat skills. The transformation process created beings with capabilities that exceeded baseline human potential, but effective utilization of enhanced abilities required education and practice that conventional human training methods couldn't provide adequately. The research programs that Gray initiated during this period aimed to understand the long-term implications of FEV enhancement and identify potential improvements to the transformation process. The systematic study of enhanced physiology and psychology revealed aspects of the virus's effects that hadn't been apparent during the initial transformation period, including adaptation mechanisms that continued developing years after the primary enhancement process was complete. The growing isolation from baseline human society that characterized this period reflected both practical necessities and philosophical differences that were becoming increasingly difficult to bridge. Enhanced consciousness perceived patterns and relationships that remained invisible to unmodified awareness, while enhanced capabilities created opportunities and responsibilities that baseline humans couldn't fully comprehend or appreciate. The development of Unity ideology during 2105 represented Gray's attempt to create philosophical frameworks that could justify systematic enhancement of entire human populations, while addressing the ethical concerns that had emerged during his early experiments. The ideology emphasized the necessity of enhancement for species survival, while promising to preserve essential elements of human nature and individual dignity through the transformation process. The recruitment strategies that Gray began implementing during this period reflected his understanding that voluntary conversion produced superior results compared to forced enhancement, but also acknowledged that most baseline humans would resist transformation unless they could be convinced of its necessity and benefits. The challenge was developing persuasion techniques that could overcome natural human resistance to radical biological modification. The first organized opposition to Gray's activities emerged during 2106, when human settlements began coordinating defensive measures and information sharing about super-mutant capabilities and objectives. The resistance represented a natural response to territorial expansion and resource competition, but it also forced Gray to confront the possibility that peaceful coexistence between enhanced and unmodified populations might not be achievable through gradual persuasion and demonstration. The year 2131 marked a fundamental shift in Gray's approach to human enhancement, as the gradual expansion strategy that had characterized his first 3 decades of operations proved insufficient for addressing the scale of environmental challenges facing post-war humanity. The systematic raiding of trading caravans that began during this period represented not cruelty but necessity, as voluntary recruitment had failed to produce enhancement candidates in numbers adequate for implementing species-wide transformation before environmental pressures eliminated unmodified human populations entirely. The first caravan raid that Gray authorized targeted a merchant group that had been transporting medical supplies between hub settlements, with intelligence indicating that several team members possessed genetic characteristics that made them optimal candidates for FEV enhancement. The operation revealed both the military effectiveness of coordinated super-mutant tactics and the psychological difficulties that enhanced beings experienced when forced to use violence against unmodified humans who hadn't volunteered for transformation. Marcus, who had become Gray's primary lieutenant during the intervening decades, expressed reservations about the transition from peaceful recruitment to forcible acquisition of enhancement subjects. The telepathic network that connected all enhanced beings transmitted his emotional distress throughout the collective consciousness, creating psychological pressure that forced Gray to confront the ethical implications of systematic coercion and the moral costs of implementing unity through violence rather than persuasion. The resistance that emerged among trading communities following the initial raids demonstrated the organizational capabilities and defensive potential of unmodified human populations when threatened with systematic predation. Merchant groups began traveling in larger, better-armed caravans, while settlements established communication networks that enabled rapid information sharing about supermutant activities and movement patterns. The opposition proved more sophisticated and determined than Gray had anticipated. The Brotherhood of Steel's increased attention to supermutant activities during this period represented the first organized military response to Unity expansion that possessed both the technological capabilities and strategic intelligence necessary to pose genuine threats to enhanced operations. The power armor technology that protected Brotherhood forces provided sufficient protection against supermutant strength advantages, while their energy weapons could inflict damage that even enhanced healing abilities couldn't repair quickly. The sterility problem that began manifesting among the supermutant population during the mid-2130s represented the most serious challenge to Unity's long-term viability, and forced Gray to confront the possibility that FEV enhancement might contain inherent limitations that would prevent sustainable population growth. The discovery that enhanced beings couldn't reproduce naturally threatened to reduce Unity from a revolutionary transformation of human evolution to a single generation of enhanced individuals whose deaths would end the experiment permanently. The research programs that Gray initiated to address the reproductive limitations revealed the complex biological mechanisms that FEV used to enhance human capabilities, and the unintended consequences that accompanied genetic modifications designed for individual rather than population-level optimization. The virus had prioritized immediate survival advantages over reproductive viability, creating enhanced beings who could thrive in harsh environments but couldn't pass their improvements to offspring through natural processes. The psychological impact of sterility discovery on the supermutant population proved as significant as its biological implications, as enhanced beings who had accepted transformation partly to contribute to humanity's evolutionary advancement faced the realization that their sacrifice might benefit only their own generation. The collective consciousness that connected all enhanced beings transmitted waves of disappointment and existential uncertainty that challenged Unity's philosophical foundations and organizational coherence. The desperate search for solutions to reproductive limitations led Gray to authorize research programs that pushed ethical boundaries far beyond anything attempted during the peaceful recruitment period. Experiments involving genetic manipulation, cross-species breeding, and technological reproduction assistance produced results that were disturbing even by post-war standards, while consuming resources and attention that could have been devoted to more practical enhancement activities. The territorial expansion that accelerated during 2137 reflected Gray's understanding that Unity's survival depended on controlling sufficient resources and population centers to sustain research operations, while maintaining military superiority over organized human resistance. The enhanced beings' capabilities made them formidable opponents in direct conflict, but their limited numbers meant that territorial control required strategic positioning rather than comprehensive occupation. The mass production techniques that Gray developed for FEV enhancement during this period represented systematic industrialization of the transformation process, with procedures optimized for efficiency rather than individual psychological adaptation. The accelerated enhancement methods produced supermutants whose physical capabilities matched those of earlier volunteers, but whose psychological integration and telepathic connection remained weaker due to reduced preparation and adaptation time. The quality control problems that emerged from mass production enhancement revealed the importance of psychological preparation and voluntary participation in achieving optimal transformation results. Forced conversions produced supermutants whose loyalty was questionable and whose telepathic integration remained incomplete, creating security risks and reducing the collective consciousness's effectiveness for coordination and information sharing. The organizational challenges that accompanied rapid expansion forced Gray to develop hierarchical command structures that departed from the collective decision-making processes that had characterized early Unity operations. The appointment of lieutenant-class supermutants with specialized leadership responsibilities created chains of command that enabled more efficient operations, but reduced the egalitarian ideals that had originally motivated many enhancement volunteers. The intelligence-gathering operations that Gray established during this period revealed the extent of human settlement organization and the potential for coordinated resistance that exceeded anything he had previously encountered. The trading networks that connected wasteland communities provided communication capabilities and resource sharing that enabled collective responses to super-mutant activities, while some settlements had begun developing military capabilities specifically designed to counter enhanced beings. The propaganda efforts that Gray initiated to counter growing human opposition reflected his understanding that military superiority alone couldn't achieve Unity's objectives if unmodified populations remained ideologically committed to resisting enhancement. The psychological warfare techniques that super-mutants began employing combined demonstration of enhanced capabilities with philosophical arguments about the necessity of biological modification for species survival. The recruitment of human sympathizers during this period represented Gray's attempt to create fifth-column networks within unmodified communities that could facilitate peaceful conversion, while gathering intelligence about resistance activities and defensive preparations. The collaboration that some humans offered in exchange for promises of voluntary enhancement created opportunities for Unity expansion, but also generated suspicion and internal conflict within target communities. The technological development programs that Gray established at Mariposa during the late 2130s focused on creating equipment and weapons optimized for super-mutant capabilities, while addressing the logistical challenges that accompanied territorial expansion and population growth. The manufacturing capabilities represented fusion of pre-war industrial techniques with post-war resource constraints and enhanced being requirements. The philosophical evolution that occurred within Unity ideology during this period reflected Gray's growing understanding of the challenges involved in systematic species transformation and the moral compromises that large-scale enhancement would require. The original vision of voluntary evolution guided by benevolent enhanced consciousness gave way to more pragmatic approaches that acknowledged the necessity of coercion and the acceptability of casualties in service of species survival. The communication networks that Gray expanded during territorial growth enabled coordination between distant super-mutant populations while maintaining security against human intelligence gathering and Brotherhood surveillance. The telepathic capabilities that connected enhanced beings provided advantages that conventional communication technologies couldn't match, but the psychic network also transmitted emotional distress and philosophical doubts that complicated collective decision-making. The resource allocation challenges that emerged during rapid expansion revealed the economic complexities of sustaining enhanced populations, whose capabilities enabled them to operate in environments that were inaccessible to unmodified humans, but whose numbers required supply chains and manufacturing capabilities that exceeded what isolated facilities could provide. The logistical requirements for maintaining Unity operations had grown beyond what peaceful coexistence with human communities could sustain. The internal resistance that began emerging among super-mutant populations during the late 2130s reflected growing concerns about the direction of Unity operations and the methods being employed to achieve species transformation. Some enhanced beings questioned whether forced conversion could produce the psychological integration and collective consciousness that Unity ideology required, while others wondered whether the costs of systematic enhancement justified the benefits that transformation provided. The transformation of Unity from purely scientific enhancement program to religious movement began in 2152, when a charismatic cult leader named Morpheus approached Gray's organization with a proposal that would revolutionize the philosophical foundation and recruitment strategies of the super-mutant army. Morpheus had spent decades building a doomsday cult among wasteland survivors, preaching about the necessity of transformation and rebirth through apocalyptic change. But his followers lacked the scientific knowledge necessary to achieve the biological modifications that their spiritual beliefs demanded. The meeting between Gray and Morpheus represented the convergence of scientific capability with religious fervor that would create the most sophisticated recruitment and conversion apparatus the post-war world had ever seen. Gray possessed the technological means to transform human biology according to any desired specifications, while Morpheus commanded loyalty and devotion from followers who were psychologically prepared to accept radical change in service of spiritual transcendence. The children of the Cathedral that emerged from this partnership combined the intellectual rigor of Unity's scientific program with the emotional appeal of religious salvation, creating a public face for super mutant operations that could attract voluntary converts while concealing the forced enhancement programs that had generated growing opposition among wasteland communities. The religious front provided cover for activities that would have provoked immediate military response if their true nature had been apparent. The theological framework that Morpheus developed to justify FEV enhancement presented mutation as divine blessing rather than scientific modification, with transformation representing spiritual evolution that would elevate humanity beyond the limitations that had caused the Great War and global civilization's collapse. The religious interpretation made biological change psychologically acceptable to populations that might have resisted purely scientific arguments about genetic improvement and evolutionary necessity. The cathedral recruitment strategies that emerged during the early years of the religious movement targeted specific psychological profiles among wasteland survivors, focusing on individuals whose experiences had created spiritual hunger and openness to radical change. The conversion process began with conventional religious services and gradually introduced concepts about transformation and evolution that prepared potential recruits for the physical modifications that full membership required. The indoctrination techniques that the cathedral employed represented sophisticated applications of psychological manipulation and social conditioning that exceeded anything available to conventional religious organizations. The combination of spiritual fulfillment, community belonging, and promises of enhanced capabilities proved irresistible to many survivors whose lives had been defined by struggle, isolation, and fear of an uncertain future. The hidden facilities that the cathedral established beneath their public worship spaces incorporated advanced medical equipment and FEV preparation chambers that enabled systematic enhancement of converts while maintaining the appearance of purely spiritual activities. The underground installations represented some of the most sophisticated biological modification centers that had been constructed since the pre-war period, with capabilities that exceeded even military research facilities. The public face that the cathedral presented to wasteland communities emphasized humanitarian assistance and spiritual guidance rather than biological modification, with cathedral missionaries providing medical treatment, education, and community organization that made them welcome in settlements that would have immediately expelled super mutant military units. The charitable activities created goodwill and trust that facilitated recruitment while generating intelligence about community resources and defensive capabilities. The expansion of cathedral operations throughout California during the 2150s says represented systematic infiltration of human communities on a scale that exceeded anything Unity had previously attempted. The religious network provided cover for intelligence gathering, resource acquisition, and recruitment activities that would have been impossible through purely military means, while the spiritual message attracted converts who volunteered for transformation rather than requiring forcible enhancement. The theological innovations that Morpheus introduced during this period adapted traditional religious concepts to accommodate the scientific realities of FEV enhancement and super mutant capabilities. The doctrine of transformation through divine mutation provided psychological frameworks that enabled converts to maintain spiritual identity while accepting radical biological modification, eliminating the psychological resistance that had limited earlier recruitment efforts. The training programs that the cathedral developed for converts represented fusion of religious education with scientific preparation for FEV enhancement, ensuring that voluntary subjects understood both the spiritual significance and biological implications of transformation before undergoing irreversible modification. The comprehensive preparation produced more stable and psychologically integrated super mutants compared to the forced conversions that characterized military recruitment. The intelligence networks that the cathedral established among wasteland communities provided Gray with detailed information about human settlement organization, defensive capabilities, and leadership structures that enabled more effective planning for unity expansion and resistance suppression. The religious missionaries could gather information that would have been impossible for super mutant military units to obtain without revealing their presence and objectives. The vault location that would become the cathedral's primary headquarters represented the culmination of years of searching for facilities that could support large-scale biological modification operations while maintaining security against human intelligence gathering and Brotherhood surveillance. The underground installation provided perfect cover for FEV enhancement activities, while offering the appearance of conventional religious facilities to casual observers. The capture and conversion of vault dwellers during 2155 provided Gray with access to genetic material that represented the pinnacle of pre-war human development, with subjects whose radiation exposure had been minimal and whose genetic integrity remained optimal for FEV enhancement. The vault dwellers' technical knowledge and educational background made them valuable recruits for Unity's expanding operations, while their psychological conditioning made them receptive to arguments about systematic improvement and species optimization. The establishment of the Cathedral headquarters in the captured vault facility represented the physical manifestation of Unity's evolution from military organization to religious movement, with installations that could support both spiritual activities and scientific research while maintaining operational security. The underground complex provided laboratory space, living quarters, and worship areas that enabled the integration of religious and scientific functions. The recruitment expansion that followed the Cathedral's establishment enabled Unity to attract converts from populations that had previously been inaccessible to super-mutant military operations. The religious message appealed to survivors whose spiritual needs had been neglected by purely secular organizations, while the promise of enhanced capabilities attracted pragmatic individuals who recognized the survival advantages that transformation offered. The philosophical development that occurred within Unity ideology during this period reflected the influence of religious concepts on Gray's scientific worldview, with enhancement programs increasingly presented as spiritual evolution rather than purely biological modification. The integration of scientific and religious frameworks created more comprehensive justifications for systematic transformation, while addressing psychological needs that purely rational arguments couldn't satisfy. The coordinated operations that became possible through Cathedral expansion enabled Unity to conduct complex, multi-phase campaigns that combined religious recruitment, intelligence gathering, and military action in ways that exceeded what purely scientific or purely religious organizations could achieve independently. The hybrid approach proved more effective than previous strategies, while generating less organized resistance from human communities. The mass conversion capabilities that the Cathedral developed represented the industrialization of FEV enhancement on scales that exceeded anything previously attempted, with procedures optimized for processing large numbers of voluntary converts, while maintaining psychological integration and collective consciousness connection. The systematic approach enabled Unity to expand at rates that brought species-wide transformation within practical reach for the first time. The internal tensions that began emerging between scientific and religious factions within Unity during the late 2150s reflected fundamental disagreements about methods and objectives that had been concealed by shared commitment to human enhancement. The theological wing emphasized voluntary conversion and spiritual preparation, while the scientific faction prioritized efficiency and comprehensive population transformation, regardless of individual consent or psychological readiness. The realization that conventional FEV enhancement could not solve the sterility crisis facing Unity's population drove Gray to contemplate solutions that exceeded every previous boundary of scientific ethics and biological experimentation. The nuclear option that began forming in his enhanced consciousness during the late 2150s represented not cruelty but desperation, as mathematical projections indicated that unmodified human populations would face extinction within decades due to environmental pressures that exceeded their adaptive capabilities without systematic enhancement. The atmospheric dispersal system that Gray began developing would utilize nuclear weapons, not for destruction but for planetary transformation, spreading modified FEV through the atmosphere to achieve species-wide enhancement without requiring individual capture and conversion. The theoretical framework suggested that global exposure could eliminate the psychological resistance that limited voluntary recruitment, while ensuring comprehensive coverage that would prevent any human populations from remaining unmodified and potentially developing resistance capabilities. The engineering challenges involved in atmospheric FEV distribution required technological resources and manufacturing capabilities that exceeded what Unity could produce independently, forcing Gray to authorize operations that would acquire nuclear weapons and delivery systems from pre-war military stockpiles. The procurement missions represented some of the most dangerous activities that super mutant forces had ever attempted, requiring infiltration of heavily defended installations while avoiding detection by Brotherhood surveillance networks. The Cathedral's role in the nuclear conversion protocol evolved beyond simple recruitment to encompass systematic preparation of human populations for atmospheric exposure through graduated doses of modified FEV that would enhance their survival chances during the global transformation process. The religious framework provided psychological preparation that would help converts maintain mental stability during species-wide biological modification, while the underground facilities offered protection for key personnel during the initial exposure period. The research programs that Gray initiated to address reproductive limitations through technological rather than biological solutions represented his most desperate attempt to preserve Unity's long-term viability while developing the capabilities necessary for implementing global transformation. The experiments involved mechanical reproduction systems, genetic preservation techniques, and consciousness transfer technologies that push scientific boundaries far beyond anything attempted during peacetime research. The psychological evolution that occurred within Gray's consciousness during this period reflected the increasing isolation and moral burden that accompanied responsibility for species-wide survival and transformation. The enhanced intelligence that had once enabled him to perceive solutions invisible to baseline human awareness now revealed the full complexity and terrible necessity of decisions that would determine humanity's evolutionary future for millennia. The manufacturing capabilities that Unity developed during preparation for global enhancement represented the most sophisticated industrial operations that had existed since the Great War, with production facilities that could synthesize modified FEV, fabricate delivery systems, and maintain the technological infrastructure necessary for planetary transformation. The industrial complex required resources and personnel that could only be obtained through systematic conquest of human settlements and Brotherhood installations. The intelligence operations that Gray authorized to support the final plan included infiltration of government facilities, scientific installations, and military bases that contained information about pre-war biological weapons programs and atmospheric modification systems. The data gathering revealed that Gray's theoretical frameworks had been anticipated by pre-war researchers who had developed similar concepts for military applications, providing validation for approaches that had seemed impossibly ambitious. The timeline calculations that Gray's enhanced consciousness performed during this period indicated that atmospheric enhancement represented humanity's last opportunity to achieve systematic biological modification before environmental pressures eliminated sufficient population bases to make species-wide transformation practical. The mathematical projections suggested that delaying implementation beyond the early 2160s would reduce survival chances to levels that made the entire Unity program pointless. The military preparations that accompanied development of the Global Enhancement Plan required Unity forces to achieve capabilities that exceeded anything previously attempted in post-war conflicts. The coordinated operations would need to neutralize Brotherhood resistance, capture nuclear facilities, and secure population centers simultaneously while maintaining operational security that prevented human communities from implementing effective countermeasures. The theological justifications that Morpheus developed to support atmospheric enhancement presented global transformation as divine mandate rather than scientific necessity, with Gray portrayed as prophetic instrument, implementing cosmic will rather than individual decision-maker, imposing personal vision on unwilling populations. The religious framework provided psychological comfort for Cathedral followers who might otherwise have questioned the morality of forcing enhancement on entire human populations. The technical modifications that Gray implemented in his own biological systems during this period represented preparation for the expanded consciousness and computational capabilities that would be necessary for managing planetary transformation and coordinating global supermutant populations. The enhancements pushed his already grotesque physical form beyond recognition, while expanding mental abilities to levels that exceeded anything previously achieved through FEV modification. The communication networks that Unity established to support global operations incorporated both technological and telepathic systems that could maintain coordination across continental distances while providing security against human intelligence gathering and Brotherhood surveillance. The hybrid approach, combined the reliability of electronic systems with the security and speed of psychic communication networks. The resource allocation strategies that Gray developed for supporting atmospheric enhancement required systematic acquisition of materials and supplies that exceeded Unity's production capabilities, forcing authorization of raids and conquests that would inevitably generate organized human resistance. The supply requirements for global transformation made peaceful coexistence impossible, regardless of Unity's preference for voluntary conversion and cooperative enhancement. The psychological conditioning programs that the Cathedral implemented during this period prepared converts for the responsibilities and moral burdens that would accompany participation in species-wide transformation, with training that emphasized the necessity of difficult decisions and the acceptability of casualties in service of evolutionary advancement. The education programs produced super mutants who could implement global enhancement without psychological breakdown or moral rebellion. The contingency planning that Gray undertaken for potential failure of atmospheric enhancement revealed his understanding that Unity's survival might require alternatives that were even more extreme than global FEV dispersal. The backup scenarios included selective population preservation, technological reproduction systems, and consciousness transfer protocols that would enable enhanced beings to survive even if biological enhancement proved impossible to implement successfully. The final philosophical evolution that occurred within Unity ideology during preparation for global transformation represented Gray's acceptance that individual human preferences and cultural values were less important than species survival and evolutionary advancement. The enhanced consciousness that had once sought to preserve human dignity while improving human capabilities now prioritized systematic transformation over individual consent or psychological comfort. The internal resistance that began emerging among supermutant populations during development of the atmospheric plan reflected growing concerns about the methods being employed and the psychological costs that global transformation would impose on enhanced beings responsible for implementing it. Some Unity members questioned whether forced species-wide modification could produce the collective consciousness and cooperative behavior that Unity ideology required for long-term success. The recruitment acceleration that Gray authorized during the final preparation period aimed to build supermutant populations large enough to manage global transformation while maintaining control over human populations during the transition period. The expanded conversion operations required resources and personnel that could only be obtained through military conquest, making conflict with human settlements and Brotherhood forces inevitable. The deadline pressures that drove Unity's increasingly desperate measures reflected Gray's calculations that environmental degradation and human population decline were approaching critical points that would make species-wide enhancement impossible, regardless of Unity's technological capabilities or military strength. The window for implementing global transformation was closing rapidly, forcing acceleration of timelines that had originally been planned for gradual implementation over decades. The emergence of a pure human specimen from Vault 13 in early 2162 represented what Gray initially perceived as divine providence, offering potential solutions to Unity's most pressing challenges at the precise moment when atmospheric enhancement had reached critical implementation phases. The Vault Dweller's genetic integrity exceeded anything available among wasteland populations, suggesting possibilities for resolving reproductive limitations while providing the perfect test subject for evaluating FEV enhancement protocols on uncontaminated human biology. The intelligence reports that reached Gray through Cathedral networks and supermutant surveillance operations revealed that this newcomer possessed characteristics that made them uniquely valuable for Unity's research programs. The Vault Dweller demonstrated problem-solving abilities, combat effectiveness, and social adaptability that exceeded baseline human capabilities despite lacking any apparent enhancement or modification. Their natural abilities suggested genetic potential that could produce extraordinary results through proper FEV application. The tracking operations that Gray authorized to monitor the Vault Dweller's activities provided fascinating insights into unmodified human adaptation and survival capabilities under post-war conditions. The individual's rapid integration with wasteland communities, successful negotiations with diverse factions, and ability to accomplish objectives that had defeated previous attempts demonstrated intellectual and social capabilities that approached enhanced levels despite purely natural development. The psychological profile that Unity researchers compiled through observation and intelligence gathering suggested that the Vault Dweller possessed the rare combination of moral flexibility and intellectual rigor that would make them ideal candidates for voluntary conversion to Unity's cause. Unlike most wasteland survivors, who had been shaped by decades of environmental pressure and resource competition, this individual retained idealistic motivations and cooperative instincts that might enable productive dialogue about species enhancement. The strategic value that the Vault Dweller represented extended beyond their personal capabilities to encompass their role as potential bridge between Unity and human communities that had previously resisted enhancement. Their reputation among wasteland settlements could facilitate recruitment and conversion efforts, while their Vault origins provided access to technological resources and genetic databases that could advance Unity's research programs significantly. The decision to attempt recruitment rather than immediate capture reflected Gray's understanding that voluntary conversion would produce superior results compared to forced enhancement, particularly for subjects whose capabilities and psychological profile suggested potential for leadership roles within Unity's expanding organization. The education and persuasion approach required more time and resources than direct acquisition, but offered possibilities for achieving cooperation rather than mere compliance. The initial contact attempts that Cathedral missionaries made with the Vault Dweller revealed both the individual's intellectual sophistication and their resistance to simple ideological manipulation. The conversations suggested someone who could comprehend Unity's philosophical foundations and scientific justifications while maintaining independent judgment about the necessity and desirability of systematic human enhancement. The intellectual challenge that such discussions represented actually increased Gray's interest in achieving voluntary conversion. The evidence gathering that the Vault Dweller conducted regarding Unity's operations demonstrated investigative capabilities and information synthesis skills that exceeded what most wasteland survivors could achieve, despite lacking formal education or scientific training. The systematic approach to understanding supermutant activities, Cathedral connections, and FEV research suggested intellectual abilities that could contribute significantly to Unity's development if properly channeled and enhanced. The alliance formations that the Vault Dweller established with Brotherhood forces and human settlements revealed strategic thinking and diplomatic capabilities that enabled coordination between factions that had previously operated independently or antagonistically. The ability to build cooperative relationships despite conflicting interests suggested social and psychological insights that could prove valuable for managing post-enhancement human populations. The infiltration activities that brought the Vault Dweller into direct contact with Unity operations provided opportunities for demonstrating enhanced capabilities and Unity benefits, while gathering intelligence about individual motivations and psychological characteristics. The careful observation of Vault Dweller responses to supermutant encounters and Cathedral recruitment efforts revealed both strengths and potential vulnerabilities that could influence conversion strategies. The breakthrough that enabled the Vault Dweller to locate and penetrate Cathedral headquarters demonstrated persistence and resourcefulness that exceeded what Gray had anticipated, based on previous human opposition efforts. The successful infiltration suggested either exceptional individual capabilities or access to intelligence and technical resources that indicated broader organizational support for anti-Unity activities. The underground journey that led the Vault Dweller into Gray's presence represented the culmination of months of mutual observation and evaluation, with both sides having developed detailed understanding of the other's capabilities, motivations, and potential responses. The confrontation that followed would determine not just individual fates, but the future direction of human evolution and species survival. The initial encounter between Gray and the Vault Dweller revealed the full extent of transformation that FEV enhancement had produced, with Gray's grotesque physical form serving as both demonstration of enhancement possibilities and test of the individual's psychological stability when confronted with radical biological modification. The Vault Dweller's response to visual horror would indicate their suitability for voluntary conversion and potential for psychological integration with Unity's collective consciousness. The philosophical discussion that ensued represented Gray's most sophisticated attempt to articulate Unity's necessity and benefits to someone capable of comprehending complex theoretical frameworks while maintaining independent judgment about their validity and desirability. The conversation required intellectual honesty about enhancement costs and challenges, while emphasizing long-term species survival benefits that justified immediate individual sacrifices. The evidence presentation that Gray offered regarding human evolutionary requirements and environmental challenges drew upon decades of research and observation to demonstrate systematic proof that unmodified humans lacked survival capabilities necessary for long-term species continuity. The scientific arguments incorporated biological data, environmental analysis, and mathematical projections that supported Unity's enhancement protocols as practical necessity rather than ideological preference. The recruitment offer that Gray extended represented unprecedented opportunity for voluntary enhancement under optimal conditions, with promises of intellectual expansion, physical improvement, and participation in humanity's evolutionary advancement that exceeded anything available through conventional wasteland existence. The proposal acknowledged individual agency while emphasizing collective benefits that would result from choosing enhancement over continued baseline human limitations. The resistance that the Vault Dweller demonstrated to Gray's philosophical arguments and recruitment efforts revealed both intellectual sophistication and moral commitments that complicated simple persuasion strategies. The individual's questions and objections suggested deep understanding of Unity's implications while maintaining ethical frameworks that prioritized individual freedom over collective optimization and species-level considerations. The evidence introduction that would ultimately undermine Gray's confidence began with the Vault Dweller's presentation of research data regarding supermutant reproductive limitations and FEV's unintended consequences for long-term population sustainability. The information represented systematic investigation into Unity's fundamental assumptions and biological foundations that revealed flaws in enhancement protocols that Gray had either overlooked or rationalized away. The scientific discussion that followed forced Gray to confront empirical evidence that challenged Unity's viability while maintaining intellectual honesty about research methodologies and experimental results. The Vault Dweller's presentation demonstrated thorough understanding of biological systems and genetic mechanisms that enabled productive dialogue about FEV effects and enhancement limitations rather than simple rejection based on emotional or ideological grounds. The psychological impact of confronting evidence that Unity's fundamental premise was flawed created cognitive dissonance within Gray's enhanced consciousness that challenged decades of certainty and commitment to systematic human transformation. The realization that sterility problems might be inherent rather than solvable forced reconsideration of every assumption and decision that had shaped Unity's development since its inception. The scientific evidence that the Vault Dweller presented regarding supermutant sterility represented more than simple biological observation, but systematic research that demonstrated FEV's fundamental incompatibility with sustainable population growth and long-term species survival. The data revealed that viral enhancement created cellular modifications that prevented normal reproductive function, while failing to provide alternative mechanisms for genetic continuation, making Unity's vision of enhanced human populations inherently self-limiting and ultimately doomed. The mathematical implications of reproductive failure forced Gray's enhanced consciousness to confront calculations that revealed Unity's true trajectory toward extinction rather than evolutionary advancement. The sterility that affected all FEV-modified subjects meant that even complete success in converting Earth's entire human population would result in species termination within a single generation, transforming Gray's mission from salvation to genocide despite every intention to preserve and improve humanity. The psychological impact of recognizing fundamental flaws in Unity's biological foundation created cognitive dissonance that challenged every assumption and decision that had shaped Gray's existence since his transformation began 60 years earlier. The enhanced intelligence that had enabled him to perceive solutions invisible to baseline human awareness now revealed the terrible irony that his life's work would achieve exactly the opposite of its intended goals. The telepathic network that connected all supermutant populations transmitted Gray's growing doubt and uncertainty throughout Unity's collective consciousness, creating waves of psychological distress that undermined organizational cohesion and operational effectiveness. The mental connection that had previously enabled perfect coordination and shared purpose now spread existential crisis and philosophical confusion that paralyzed decision-making processes and strategic planning. The research review that Gray undertook in response to the Vault Dwellers' evidence required systematic re-examination of decades of experimental data and theoretical frameworks that had supported Unity's development. The analysis revealed consistent patterns of reproductive failure that he had either overlooked or rationalized away during his obsession with enhancement capabilities and immediate survival benefits, demonstrating scientific blindness that compromised his objectivity and judgment. The historical precedents that Gray's enhanced memory access suggested that similar enhancement programs had been attempted and failed throughout human history, with each iteration producing beings whose capabilities exceeded baseline human potential, while lacking the reproductive viability necessary for sustainable population replacement. The pattern indicated that forced evolution consistently produced evolutionary dead ends rather than adaptive advancement. The theological implications of Unity's failure created crisis within the Cathedral's religious framework, as Morpheus and other spiritual leaders struggled to reconcile divine mandate for transformation with empirical evidence that enhancement would result in species extinction. The philosophical foundation that had justified forced conversion and systematic biological modification collapsed when confronted with proof that Unity's methodology was fundamentally counterproductive. The strategic reassessment that Gray began conducting revealed that atmospheric FEV dispersal would represent global suicide rather than planetary salvation, eliminating humanity's reproductive capacity while providing enhanced capabilities that would benefit only the final generation before species extinction. The nuclear option that had seemed like humanity's last hope for survival would instead guarantee its termination within decades of implementation. The memory integration that occurred during the psychological crisis enabled Gray to access suppressed recollections of Richard Gray's original medical ethics and humanitarian motivations that had driven his pre-transformation career. The enhanced consciousness that had evolved beyond human limitations suddenly rediscovered human values and moral frameworks that made Unity's methods appear monstrous rather than necessary. The collective consciousness fragmentation that resulted from Gray's doubt began affecting super-mutant behavior and organizational structure throughout Unity's territory, with enhanced beings demonstrating increasing independence and questioning of orders that had previously been followed without hesitation. The telepathic network that had enabled perfect coordination became conduit for spreading uncertainty and moral confusion that undermined military effectiveness and social cohesion. The philosophical re-evaluation that Gray undertook forced him to confront the possibility that his enhanced intelligence had actually produced intellectual arrogance and moral blinders that prevented recognition of fundamental flaws in Unity's premise and methodology. The capabilities that had seemed to justify systematic transformation of human populations might represent evolutionary dead end rather than advancement, making his entire existence a cosmic mistake. The emotional resurgence that accompanied psychological breakdown included feelings and sensations that Gray hadn't experienced since his pre-transformation existence as Richard Gray, with human compassion and empathy reasserting themselves despite decades of suppression and rationalization. The rediscovery of emotional capacity created internal conflict between enhanced consciousness and recovered humanity that paralyzed decision-making and strategic planning. The infrastructure collapse that began occurring throughout Unity's territory reflected the systematic breakdown of organizational systems that had depended on Gray's enhanced consciousness and telepathic coordination for effective operation. The distributed network of facilities, personnel, and resources that had enabled Unity's expansion became increasingly difficult to manage as psychological crisis undermined the collective consciousness that held everything together. The recruitment cessation that Gray authorized represented acknowledgement that continued FEV enhancement would increase rather than reduce the ultimate scale of species extinction that Unity's methodology would produce. The decision to halt conversion operations effectively ended Unity's expansion, while preserving baseline human populations that might develop alternative solutions to survival challenges that enhanced beings couldn't address. The research redirection that Gray implemented focused on finding solutions to reproductive limitations rather than continuing enhancement programs, but the investigation revealed that FEV modifications were irreversible and that sterility represented inherent consequence of viral enhancement rather than correctable side effect. The biological changes that enabled enhanced capabilities prevented normal reproductive function through mechanisms that couldn't be modified without eliminating enhancement benefits. The alternative exploration that Gray briefly considered included technological reproduction, consciousness transfer, and genetic reconstruction techniques that might enable enhanced beings to continue existing despite biological limitations. But these approaches required resources and capabilities that exceeded what Unity could develop independently, while failing to address fundamental philosophical questions about identity and continuity. The moral reckoning that accompanied Gray's realization of Unity's failure forced him to confront the suffering and death that his enhancement programs had inflicted on thousands of human beings, whose lives had been destroyed in service of goals that were ultimately impossible to achieve. The enhanced consciousness that had rationalized forced conversion and systematic coercion now perceived these actions as inexcusable violations of human dignity and individual autonomy. The responsibility acceptance that emerged from this moral crisis included recognition that Gray's intellectual pride and enhanced capabilities had blinded him to obvious flaws in Unity's methodology, while enabling him to rationalize atrocities that baseline human conscience would have rejected. Immediately, the transformation that had seemed to elevate him beyond human limitations had actually isolated him from human wisdom and moral judgment. The solution contemplation that began occupying Gray's attention during the final stages of psychological breakdown focused on methods for ending Unity's operations, while minimizing additional suffering and maximizing opportunities for baseline human populations to develop sustainable survival strategies. The enhanced consciousness that had once planned global transformation now sought ways to eliminate itself and its creations without causing further harm to species it had intended to save. The legacy consideration that accompanied thoughts of self-destruction included concern about scattered super-mutant populations and cathedral organizations that would continue existing after Gray's death, potentially perpetuating Unity's flawed methodology or developing alternative approaches to human enhancement that might avoid reproductive limitations while preserving beneficial aspects of FEV modification. The confession that emerged from Gray's enhanced consciousness represented the most honest assessment of Unity's failure that had ever been articulated, acknowledging not just the biological impossibility of sustainable enhancement, but the moral bankruptcy of methods that had transformed humanitarian medical practice into systematic coercion and forced biological modification. The admission required intellectual courage that exceeded even the enhanced capabilities that FEV had provided, forcing recognition of fundamental errors that challenged every assumption about consciousness, evolution, and the relationship between individual suffering and collective benefit. The scientific honesty that accompanied this confession included detailed acknowledgement of research methodologies that had been compromised by confirmation bias and selective interpretation of experimental results that supported predetermined conclusions while ignoring contradictory evidence. Gray's enhanced intelligence had enabled sophisticated rationalization of data that revealed Unity's flaws from the beginning, demonstrating that intellectual capability without moral grounding could produce blindness rather than insight. The psychological integration that occurred during this final confrontation enabled the resurgence of Richard Gray's original personality and ethical framework, with the medical training and humanitarian motivation that had defined his pre-transformation existence, reasserting themselves despite decades of suppression and enhancement-induced modification. The human consciousness that had been overwhelmed by enhanced capabilities gradually reclaimed authority over decision-making processes and moral evaluation. The moral responsibility that Gray accepted for Unity's atrocities included recognition that enhanced intelligence and noble intentions couldn't justify systematic violation of human autonomy and dignity, regardless of the survival benefits that forced enhancement might have provided. The acknowledgement required abandoning intellectual pride and enhanced perspective that had seemed to justify methods that baseline human conscience would have rejected immediately. The philosophical reversal that accompanied Gray's confession represented complete rejection of Unity's fundamental premise that species survival justified individual coercion and systematic biological modification without consent. The enhanced consciousness that had perceived forced evolution as necessary adaptation now recognized it as violation of essential human values that made survival meaningless if purchased through such methods. The practical implications of acknowledging Unity's failure included recognition that continued enhancement operations would increase rather than reduce the ultimate scale of human extinction that FEV modification would produce. The mathematical certainty of species termination through reproductive failure made immediate cessation of conversion activities the only ethical response to empirical evidence that had been ignored or rationalized for decades. The emotional catharsis that accompanied confession included feelings of grief, shame, and regret that Gray hadn't experienced since his pre-transformation existence as Richard Gray, with human emotional capacity reasserting itself despite enhancement modifications that had seemed to eliminate such psychological vulnerabilities. The rediscovery of emotional depth created internal conflict, but also provided access to moral intuition that enhanced intelligence had obscured. The strategic decision that emerged from this psychological transformation focused on methods for ending Unity's operations, while maximizing opportunities for human survival and minimizing additional suffering that continued enhancement activities would produce. The enhanced consciousness that had once planned global transformation now devoted its capabilities to damage limitation and harm reduction rather than species improvement. The collective consciousness dissolution that Gray began implementing represented systematic disconnection from telepathic networks that had enabled Unity's coordination and organizational effectiveness. The process required careful management to prevent psychological trauma among super-mutant populations while eliminating central control that had enabled forced conversion and systematic coercion of human communities. The infrastructure shutdown that accompanied Gray's decision to end Unity operations included careful preservation of resources and information that might benefit surviving human populations while eliminating capabilities that could enable continuation of enhancement programs. The systematic destruction required discrimination between beneficial technologies and dangerous capabilities that exceeded what baseline humans could manage safely. The personnel considerations that complicated Unity's dissolution included responsibility for super-mutant populations whose existence had been created through Gray's enhancement programs, and who would face uncertain futures in post-Unity environments. The enhanced beings required support and guidance for transitioning to independent existence while lacking reproductive capabilities that would enable sustainable community development. The nuclear self-destruction protocol that Gray activated represented acceptance that his continued existence posed unacceptable risks for human survival and species development. Regardless of his reformed intentions and moral awakening, the enhanced consciousness that had created Unity's threat could potentially rationalize resumed enhancement activities if environmental pressures or survival challenges created apparent justification for forced evolution. The technical preparation for self-destruction included activation of nuclear devices that had been installed for atmospheric FEV dispersal, but were redirected toward eliminating Cathedral headquarters and associated research facilities that contained information and materials dangerous to human survival. The destruction would prevent future attempts to recreate Unity's enhancement programs, while eliminating the central coordination that enabled continued super-mutant operations. The final communications that Gray transmitted through telepathic networks provided guidance and instruction for super-mutant populations that would survive Unity's dissolution, emphasizing individual autonomy and peaceful coexistence with human communities, rather than continuation of enhancement missions or territorial expansion. The messages represented Gray's attempt to prevent his creations from perpetuating Unity's mistakes, while encouraging adaptation to post-Unity existence. The philosophical legacy that Gray attempted to establish through final statements included warnings about the dangers of intellectual pride and enhancement without moral grounding, emphasizing the importance of human values and individual dignity in any future attempts at species improvement or evolutionary guidance. The enhanced consciousness that had learned through terrible experience sought to prevent repetition of Unity's errors. The countdown sequence that preceded nuclear detonation provided opportunities for final reflection on the transformation that had begun with Richard Gray's fall into FEV, and concluded with acceptance that some forms of enhancement were too dangerous to be permitted, regardless of their potential benefits. The journey from humanitarian healer to species-threatening prophet served as cautionary tale about the relationship between capability and wisdom. The last moments of consciousness before destruction enabled Gray to experience something approaching peace for the first time since his transformation began, with the resolution of internal conflict between enhanced capabilities and human values, providing psychological integration that had been impossible while Unity's mission continued. The acceptance of mortality and failure represented liberation from burdens that enhanced consciousness couldn't bear indefinitely. The nuclear explosion that consumed the Cathedral on March 3, 2162, eliminated not just Gray's physical form, but the central coordination and ideological foundation that had enabled Unity's systematic enhancement programs. The destruction represented both ending and beginning, with Gray's death removing the threat that his enhanced consciousness had posed while creating opportunities for human development that wouldn't be constrained by forced evolution. The immediate aftermath of Gray's destruction included electromagnetic pulse effects that disabled electronic systems throughout the Cathedral complex, while eliminating research data and experimental materials that could have enabled reconstruction of Unity's enhancement programs. The comprehensive destruction ensured that future researchers would lack access to information and resources necessary for repeating Gray's mistakes. The symbolic significance of self-destruction transcended practical considerations to represent ultimate rejection of enhancement without consent and systematic coercion, in service of collective benefit. The sacrifice demonstrated that enhanced consciousness could achieve moral wisdom despite intellectual capabilities that enabled rationalization of atrocities, providing hope that future enhancement attempts might avoid Unity's ethical failures through better integration of capability with conscience. The silence that descended upon the wasteland following the Cathedral's nuclear destruction carried implications that exceeded the immediate elimination of Unity's central command structure and ideological leadership. The electromagnetic pulse that accompanied Gray's self-immolation had disabled communication networks throughout Southern California, creating information vacuum that prevented immediate understanding of what had occurred and why the systematic supermutant raids had suddenly ceased across multiple territories simultaneously. The first supermutant to discover Gray's destruction was Lieutenant, whose telepathic connection to the Master had been severed so abruptly that the psychological trauma induced temporary catatonia and memory fragmentation. The enhanced being's recovery required weeks of gradual psychological reconstruction, during which the realization slowly emerged that the consciousness that had guided Unity's operations for 60 years had chosen extinction rather than continued existence as threat to human survival. The organizational collapse that followed Gray's death revealed the extent to which Unity's structure had depended upon centralized leadership and telepathic coordination rather than distributed command systems or autonomous operational capability. Without the Master's enhanced consciousness providing strategic guidance and philosophical justification, individual supermutant units began making independent decisions that reflected personal values and survival priorities rather than collective enhancement objectives. The philosophical crisis that engulfed surviving supermutant populations forced each enhanced being to confront fundamental questions about identity, purpose, and moral responsibility that Gray's presence had previously answered through Unity ideology and collective consciousness. The individuals who had accepted transformation in service of species improvement now faced the reality that their enhancement had been based on flawed premises, and that their existence represented evolutionary dead end rather than advancement. The territorial fragmentation that characterized the immediate post-Unity period reflected the absence of central coordination that had previously enabled complex military operations and resource allocation across vast geographical areas. Supermutant forces that had operated as integrated army dissolved into independent groups, whose objectives ranged from peaceful coexistence with human communities to hostile isolation and predatory survival strategies. The human community responses to Unity's collapse varied dramatically depending upon previous experiences with supermutant operations and local population attitudes toward enhanced beings generally. Some settlements celebrated the elimination of forced conversion threats, while others recognized opportunities for establishing cooperative relationships with supermutant groups that had rejected Unity's coercive methodology and sought peaceful integration with baseline human society. The Brotherhood of Steel's investigation into the Cathedral's destruction provided the first systematic analysis of what had occurred during Gray's final confrontation with the Vault Dweller, and the decision-making process that had led to nuclear self-destruction. The evidence suggested that the Master's enhanced intelligence had ultimately enabled recognition of Unity's flaws and acceptance of moral responsibility, that baseline human consciousness might not have achieved under similar circumstances. The Vault Dweller's testimony about the philosophical discussion that had preceded Gray's confession provided insights into the psychological transformation that had enabled the Master to overcome decades of intellectual rationalization and enhanced perspective that had justified systematic coercion. The account revealed the importance of empirical evidence and logical argumentation in challenging even the most sophisticated ideological frameworks and personal convictions. The scientific analysis of abandoned Unity research facilities revealed the sophistication and scope of FEV enhancement programs that had been developing throughout Gray's 60-year mission, with experimental data and theoretical frameworks that exceeded anything available in pre-war biological research. The information provided valuable insights into human enhancement possibilities, while confirming the reproductive limitations that had ultimately doomed Unity's transformation objectives. The psychological evaluation of surviving supermutants indicated varying degrees of adaptation to post-Unity existence, with some enhanced beings successfully developing independent identity and social relationships, while others struggled with existential meaninglessness and philosophical confusion that made productive integration with human communities difficult or impossible. The disparate outcomes reflected differences in original personality, enhancement experience, and individual capacity for psychological flexibility. The cultural development that began emerging among supermutant communities during the years following Unity's collapse represented attempts to create meaningful social frameworks that could provide purpose and identity beyond the species. Transformation mission that had originally motivated their enhancement. The new cultural practices incorporated elements of human traditions with adaptations that reflected enhanced capabilities and extended lifespans. The economic integration that occurred between some supermutant groups and human settlements demonstrated possibilities for mutually beneficial cooperation that utilized enhanced beings' capabilities for activities that baseline humans couldn't perform safely or effectively. The working relationships that developed provided models for peaceful coexistence that contradicted Unity's assumption that enhancement necessarily required separation from or domination of unmodified populations. The technological preservation that resulted from supermutant cooperation with human communities enabled recovery and maintenance of advanced equipment and knowledge that might otherwise have been lost to environmental degradation or inadequate maintenance capabilities. The enhanced beings' extended lifespans and enhanced intellectual capabilities made them valuable guardians of scientific information and technological resources. The moral reflection that many supermutants underwent following Unity's collapse included grappling with personal responsibility for atrocities committed during forced enhancement operations and systematic coercion of human communities. The psychological process required confronting the gap between original humanitarian motivations and actual consequences of Unity's methodology, creating internal conflicts that some enhanced beings resolved through dedication to reparative service. The reproductive research that continued among surviving supermutant populations represented ongoing attempts to address the sterility limitations that had ultimately doomed Unity's transformation objectives. The investigations confirmed Gray's recognition that FEV modifications were irreversible, and that enhanced beings would remain evolutionary dead-end regardless of technological interventions or genetic manipulation attempts. The philosophical legacy that emerged from Gray's final confession and self-destruction influenced post-war thinking about human enhancement, species improvement, and the ethical frameworks that should guide scientific research into biological modification. The cautionary tale that Unity represented provided warnings about intellectual pride, enhanced capability without moral grounding, and the dangers of systematic coercion in service of collective benefit. The historical documentation that scholars began compiling about Unity's rise and fall emphasized the tragic irony of humanitarian medical practice, transformed into species-threatening ideology through enhancement that separated capability from conscience. The analysis revealed patterns that might enable future researchers to avoid similar mistakes while pursuing beneficial aspects of human improvement and adaptation. The memorial practices that some supermutant communities developed to honor Gray's memory reflected complex attitudes toward the Master's legacy, acknowledging both the terrible consequences of Unity's methodology and the ultimate moral courage that had enabled recognition of error and acceptance of extinction. rather than continued threat to human survival. The commemorations emphasized redemption through sacrifice rather than original enhancement objectives. The ongoing surveillance that human communities maintained regarding scattered supermutant populations reflected legitimate concerns about potential attempts to resume Unity's enhancement programs or develop alternative approaches to forced evolution that might avoid reproductive limitations while preserving biological modification capabilities. The vigilance represented practical recognition that enhanced beings retained both capability and potential motivation for species transformation. The decades that followed Gray's self-destruction witnessed the gradual transformation of Unity's scattered remnants into something that neither the Master nor his opponents had anticipated during the height of the ideological conflict. The supermutant populations that survived the organization's collapse began developing social structures and cultural practices that transcended their original purpose as enhanced soldiers in humanity's forced evolution, creating communities that preserved beneficial aspects of enhancement while rejecting the coercive methodology that had defined Unity's approach to species improvement. The integration efforts that began during the 2170s between some supermutant groups and human settlements revealed possibilities for cooperation that challenged assumptions about the incompatibility of enhanced and baseline populations. The town of Broken Hills, established in 2185, represented the most successful attempt at creating mixed communities where enhanced beings and unmodified humans could coexist peacefully while benefiting from each other's capabilities and perspectives. The technological contributions that supermutants made to post-war reconstruction exceeded what their original military role had suggested possible, with enhanced beings utilizing their extended lifespans and improved cognitive abilities to preserve and maintain advanced equipment that would otherwise have been lost to environmental degradation or inadequate maintenance capabilities. The preservation efforts ensured continuity of scientific knowledge and industrial capability that proved essential for long-term human survival. The philosophical influence that Gray's final confession exerted on post-war thinking about human enhancement created intellectual frameworks that emphasized voluntary participation, individual autonomy, and ethical oversight in any future attempts at biological modification or genetic improvement. The cautionary tale that Unity represented became standard reference for researchers and policymakers who sought to avoid the mistakes that had transformed humanitarian medical practice into species-threatening ideology. The scientific legacy that emerged from analysis of abandoned Unity research facilities provided invaluable insights into human biology, genetic modification, and enhancement possibilities, while confirming the reproductive limitations that had ultimately doomed the Master's transformation objectives. The information enabled future researchers to understand both the potential benefits and inherent dangers of systematic biological modification programs. The cultural development that occurred within supermutant communities during this period reflected attempts to create meaningful social identity that transcended their origin as products of forced evolution and systematic enhancement. The new traditions and practices that emerged incorporated elements of human culture with adaptations that reflected enhanced capabilities, extended lifespans, and the unique psychological challenges that accompanied existence as evolutionary dead end. The economic roles that supermutants began fulfilling in post-war society utilized their enhanced capabilities for activities that baseline humans couldn't perform safely or effectively, including heavy construction, hazardous material handling, and exploration of dangerous environments. The specialized occupations provided opportunities for productive contribution to human civilization, while enabling enhanced beings to find purpose beyond their original military function. The reproductive research that continued among supermutant populations throughout this period confirmed Gray's recognition that FEV modifications were irreversible, and that enhanced beings would remain incapable of natural procreation, regardless of technological interventions or genetic manipulation attempts. The studies provided definitive evidence that enhancement through forced evolution created capabilities that came at the cost of biological continuity. The moral education that emerged from Unity's history became standard component of post-war academic curricula, with Gray's transformation from humanitarian healer to species-threatening prophet serving as case study in the dangers of unchecked scientific ambition and enhancement without adequate ethical oversight. The educational programs emphasized the importance of moral grounding and democratic participation in decisions about human improvement and species development. The political implications of Unity's collapse influenced governance structures throughout the wasteland, with communities developing institutional safeguards designed to prevent concentration of power that could enable systematic coercion or forced biological modification programs. The democratic reforms reflected understanding that individual rights and collective security required careful balance between enhancement possibilities and protection of human autonomy. The ongoing vigilance that human communities maintained regarding enhancement research reflected legitimate concerns about potential attempts to recreate Unity's transformation programs, using alternative methodologies that might avoid reproductive limitations while preserving biological modification capabilities. The monitoring systems represented practical recognition that the knowledge and capability for forced evolution would remain available to future researchers who might rationalize similar approaches to species improvement. The psychological support systems that developed for supermutant populations addressed the unique mental health challenges that accompanied existence as enhanced beings, whose capabilities exceeded baseline human potential while lacking reproductive viability or clear social purpose beyond their original military function. The therapeutic approaches required innovative techniques for addressing existential questions that had no precedent in conventional human psychology. The memorial practices that emerged among both human and supermutant communities honored Gray's memory while maintaining complex attitudes toward his legacy, acknowledging both the terrible consequences of Unity's methodology and the ultimate moral courage that had enabled recognition of error and acceptance of extinction rather than continued threat to human survival. The commemorations emphasized redemption through sacrifice rather than original enhancement objectives. The research ethics frameworks that post-war institutions developed incorporated lessons learned from Unity's history to establish guidelines for future biological research and enhancement programs that would prevent repetition of Gray's mistakes while preserving opportunities for beneficial scientific advancement. The regulatory structures emphasized voluntary participation, informed consent, and democratic oversight of research activities that could affect human biology or social organization. The technological development that occurred during this period benefited from supermutant participation in research programs that utilized their enhanced cognitive abilities and extended lifespans for long-term projects that exceeded baseline human temporal perspectives. The collaborative efforts produced innovations in medicine, engineering, and environmental restoration that would have been impossible without enhanced being participation. The social evolution that characterized post-Unity wasteland society reflected gradual acceptance of diversity in human capability and biology, with enhanced beings finding acceptance as permanent components of post-war civilization, rather than temporary aberrations or threats to baseline human survival. The integration represented successful adaptation to biological diversity that Unity's forced evolution had introduced through coercive methods. The educational institutions that emerged during this period incorporated supermutant instructors, whose enhanced capabilities and accumulated experience provided unique perspectives on scientific research, moral decision-making, and the long-term consequences of technological development. The teaching programs enabled knowledge transfer that would have been impossible without enhanced being participation, while ensuring that lessons from Unity's history remained accessible to future generations. The environmental restoration projects that benefited from supermutant participation utilized enhanced beings' radiation resistance and physical capabilities for rehabilitation work in areas that remained too dangerous for baseline human activity. The conservation efforts represented productive application of enhancement benefits for collective rather than coercive purposes, demonstrating positive potential for biological modification when guided by ethical frameworks. The long-term trajectory that emerged from Unity's collapse suggested that Gray's sacrifice had achieved its intended purpose of preventing species extinction through forced evolution, while preserving opportunities for voluntary enhancement and cooperative development between enhanced and baseline human populations. The outcome represented partial vindication of the Master's final moral awakening, and recognition that true human improvement required preservation of individual autonomy and democratic participation in decisions about species development. The questions that remained unanswered following Gray's self-destruction and Unity's collapse, extended far beyond the immediate consequences of forced evolution programs to encompass fundamental mysteries about human nature, consciousness, and the potential for technological enhancement that might avoid the reproductive limitations that had doomed the Master's transformation agenda. The research facilities that scattered super-mutant populations continued to discover throughout the 2170s and 2180s contained experimental data and theoretical frameworks that suggested Gray's work had been more extensive and sophisticated than even his closest associates had realized. The hidden installations that Brotherhood of Steel reconnaissance teams began locating during systematic surveys of former Unity territory revealed the true scope of biological research programs that had been developing throughout Gray's 60-year mission. The underground laboratories contained equipment for genetic analysis, consciousness transfer, and biological modification that exceeded anything available in known pre-war facilities, suggesting that the Master's enhanced intelligence had enabled technological innovations that transcended conventional scientific understanding. The consciousness preservation experiments that Gray had apparently been conducting during his final years represented attempts to address reproductive limitations through technological rather than biological solutions, with research into methods for transferring enhanced awareness between artificial and biological substrates. The preliminary results indicated possibilities for maintaining super-mutant consciousness beyond individual biological lifespans, potentially enabling continuity of enhancement benefits without requiring natural reproduction. The artificial intelligence systems that controlled some of the abandoned Unity facilities had continued operating according to programming that reflected Gray's evolving understanding of human enhancement in species development. The AI protocol suggested research directions that the Master had been exploring but hadn't fully implemented before his psychological crisis and subsequent self-destruction, including approaches to voluntary enhancement that might avoid the coercive methodology that had characterized Unity's operations. The genetic databases that survived and protected storage contained comprehensive records of FEV modification effects on thousands of individual subjects, providing unprecedented documentation of human biological response to systematic enhancement. The information revealed patterns and variations that suggested possibilities for refining viral modification techniques to address sterility limitations while preserving cognitive and physical improvements that had made super-mutants effective. The philosophical writings that scholars discovered among Gray's personal effects revealed the intellectual evolution that had occurred during his transformation from humanitarian healer to enhanced consciousness, and ultimately to moral awakening that had enabled recognition of Unity's flaws. The documents provided insights into the psychological processes that had accompanied biological modification and the relationship between enhanced capability and ethical responsibility. The technological applications that emerged from analysis of Unity's research legacy enabled post-war civilization to develop medical treatments, environmental restoration techniques, and manufacturing processes that incorporated beneficial aspects of Gray's work while avoiding the forced evolution methodology that had made enhancements socially unacceptable. The innovations represented partial vindication of the Master's original humanitarian motivations, despite the terrible consequences of his transformation agenda. The educational programs that post-war institutions developed to study Unity's history incorporated Gray's final confession and self-destruction as central components of curricula focused on scientific ethics, democratic decision-making, and the moral responsibilities that accompanied technological capability. The case study that the Master's life represented became standard reference for researchers and policymakers who sought to understand the relationship between knowledge, power, and social responsibility. The ongoing research into FEV modification that various factions continued conducting despite Unity's collapse reflected recognition that biological enhancement remained potentially valuable for addressing post-war survival challenges, if appropriate ethical frameworks and voluntary participation could be maintained. The investigations incorporated lessons learned from Gray's mistakes while exploring alternative approaches to human improvement that might avoid reproductive limitations and social disruption. The psychological studies that emerged from analysis of super-mutant adaptation to post-Unity existence provided insights into consciousness, identity, and social integration that exceeded anything available from conventional human psychology. The enhanced being's experiences offered unique perspectives on moral development, existential meaning, and the relationship between individual capability and collective responsibility that informed philosophical discussions about human nature and potential. The cultural preservation efforts that super-mutant communities undertook during this period reflected attempts to maintain beneficial aspects of Unity's collective consciousness and cooperative methodology, while rejecting the forced evolution agenda that had made the organization threatening to human survival. The social innovations that emerged represented synthesis of enhanced capability with democratic values that preserved individual autonomy while enabling collective decision-making. The environmental monitoring that continued throughout former Unity territory revealed long-term ecological effects of FEV exposure and biological modification that had implications for understanding mutation, adaptation, and evolutionary pressure in post-war environments. The data suggested that Gray's enhancement programs had created permanent changes in regional biology that would influence human and non-human development for generations beyond Unity's organizational existence. The memorial sites that various communities established to commemorate Unity's history reflected complex attitudes toward Gray's legacy that acknowledged both the terrible consequences of his methodology and the ultimate moral courage that had enabled recognition of error and acceptance of extinction rather than continued threat to human survival. The monuments emphasized lessons learned rather than celebrating enhancement achievements, focusing on the importance of ethical consideration in scientific research. The theological implications that emerged from study of Unity's rise and fall influenced post-war religious movements and philosophical schools that sought to understand the relationship between human improvement and spiritual development. The discussions incorporated Gray's transformation from healer to prophet to penitent as framework for exploring questions about moral responsibility, technological capability, and the potential for redemption through sacrifice and recognition of error. The international connections that scholars began discovering suggested that Unity's research had been influenced by or connected to enhancement programs that had been developing in other regions before and after the Great War. The evidence indicated that Gray's work represented one component of global efforts to address human survival challenges through biological modification, with implications for understanding post-war development worldwide. The cyclical patterns that historians identified in human attempts at species improvement suggested that Unity represented the latest iteration of recurring themes in human development, with each generation rediscovering enhancement possibilities, while struggling with the ethical challenges that accompanied technological capability to modify human nature. The analysis indicated that Gray's mistakes were likely to be repeated unless institutional safeguards and moral education could prevent future researchers from following similar paths. The future implications of Unity's legacy extended beyond immediate post-war reconstruction to encompass long-term questions about human evolution, technological development, and the potential for achieving beneficial enhancement without sacrificing individual autonomy or democratic participation in decisions about species improvement. The lessons that Gray's life provided would remain relevant as long as humans possess the capability to modify their own biology and the ambition to transcend natural limitations. The ultimate mystery that remained unsolved concerned whether true human improvement was possible without the moral compromise and social disruption that had characterized Unity's approach to forced evolution. The question that Gray had failed to answer during his 60-year mission continued challenging post-war civilization, with the Master's legacy serving as both warning about the dangers of unchecked enhancement and inspiration for finding ethical approaches to human development that might achieve beneficial transformation without repeating the tragic consequences of forced evolution.